The Apache village burned like a beacon in the night flames, licking the sky, turning darkness to a hellish dawn. Through the smoke and chaos, a young soldier moved against the tide of fleeing attackers, his face streaked with soot and something that looked suspiciously like shame. The screams of the dying mingled with the crackle of burning homes, creating a symphony of horror that would haunt his dreams for years to come. Amid the destruction, he found her, a small child, no more than 5, huddled beside the body of a woman who had used her final moments to hide her daughter beneath a blanket of earth and brush. The child's eyes wide with terror and grief fixed on him with an intensity that stopped his breath. In that moment, as flames devoured everything around them, the young soldier made a choice that would alter the course of 2 lives. He lifted the child and ran. 15 years later, Logan Harrington tracked the deer through the silent forest, his weathered boots making no sound on the pine-strewn ground. The Winchester rifle, an extension of his body after so many years, rested comfortably against his shoulder as he lined up the shot. 60 yards away, the buck lifted its noble head, ears twitching, unaware these would be its final moments. Logan's finger curved around the trigger, steady as the mountains that surrounded his isolated cabin. His breath slowed. The world narrowed to just him, the rifle, and the deer. He fired. The shot echoed through the canyon, startling a flock of ravens into flight. The buck dropped instantly, a clean kill. But as Logan approached the fallen animal, something shifted in his vision. For a moment, the deer was gone, replaced by a human form, a man in dirty clothes begging for mercy. One of the raiders who had taken everything from him. Logan blinked hard and the vision disappeared. The deer was just a deer again, but his hands had begun to shake. 3 years since he'd tracked down and killed the last of the gang that murdered his family, yet the memories refused to fade. Some ghosts, it seemed, could not be outrun, even in the vast wilderness of the Arizona territory. He field-dressed the deer with practiced efficiency, his movements automatic after years of surviving alone. The meat would last him weeks, though there was no joy in the task anymore. Like everything else, it was simply necessary for survival. Nothing more, nothing less. By the time Logan hauled the dressed carcass back to his cabin, the sun was beginning its descent behind the jagged peaks to the west. His home, if it could be called that, was a sturdy one-room structure, built with his own hands in the 3 years since Catherine and Emily were taken from him. It stood in a small clearing, surrounded by ponderosa pines, and sheltered on one side by a rising cliff face, defensible, isolated, as removed from civilization as a man could get, and still call himself part of the living world. Not that Logan was sure he deserved such a designation anymore. He hung the deer in his smokehouse, then washed the blood from his hands in the cold stream that ran near the cabin. As he scrubbed, he caught his reflection in the still water, a face he barely recognized anymore. At 45, he looked older, his once bright blue-green eyes now dulled, set deep in a weathered face, framed by a beard that had grown wild and streaked with gray. The man who stared back at him was a stranger, someone hollowed out and refilled with nothing but grief and regret. Inside the cabin, Logan lit the lamps and stoked the fire in the stone hearth. The familiar routine brought little comfort, but it kept the crushing silence at bay for a few minutes. The cabin was sparse but functional. A bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves stocked with preserves and supplies, and a trunk that remained locked at all times containing the few possessions he couldn't bear to look at, but couldn't bring himself to discard. On the mantel above the fireplace sat 3 items: a silver hairbrush that had belonged to Catherine, a small wooden horse he'd carved for Emily's 5th birthday, and his old Border Patrol badge tarnished with age and neglect. Logan poured himself a measure of whiskey, then set 2 empty plates on the table. A nightly ritual that even he recognized as a form of madness, yet he couldn't stop himself. He sat down, raised his glass to the empty chairs, and began to speak aloud. "Brought down a buck today," he told the emptiness. 8-pointer. Would have been proud of this one, Emily. His voice cracked on his daughter's name. "Weather's turning. Feels like snow coming." The silence that followed was as crushing as always, broken only by the occasional pop from the fire. After a moment, he continued, the words falling into a familiar pattern. "I miss you both." It was always the last thing he said before rising, taking the untouched plates and washing them carefully before putting them away until tomorrow night. Later, as the fire died down to embers, Logan sat at his crude desk and pulled out the leather-bound journal Catherine had given him on their last anniversary. He'd never been much for writing while she was alive, But now the journal had become another ritual letters to a wife who would never read them confessions to the dead. Catherine, another winter coming. 3 years now without you and Em. The silence doesn't get easier. Sometimes I think I hear your laugh carried on the wind or Emily calling from just beyond the trees. I know it's not real. I know you're both gone, but knowing doesn't make it stop. I still see their faces, the men who took you from me. I still hear their screams when I caught up to them one by one. You'd be ashamed of what I did, of what I became. The vengeance didn't bring you back. It didn't fill the hollow place inside me. It just made me more like them. I don't know why I'm still here. Maybe this is my punishment, to live with what I've done. To remember every day that I wasn't there when you needed me most. I'm sorry. God, I'm sorry. His handwriting grew increasingly unsteady as he wrote until he finally set down the pen and closed the journal. He didn't cry anymore, hadn't since the day he buried his family, but something worse than tears burned behind his eyes, a pressure that never fully released. Outside, the wind picked up, moaning through the canyon like a wounded animal. The first snowflakes began to fall ghostly white against the black night. Logan extinguished all but one lamp and climbed into his bed fully clothed except for his boots. Sleep when it came was never restful, always haunted by the same nightmares. Catherine calling his name as raiders burst through their door, Emily hiding in the closet where he would later find her small body, and more recently the faces of the men he'd hunted down and killed in the aftermath. Sometimes in the worst of these dreams, he couldn't tell who was the monster and who was the man. The storm grew stronger as the night deepened, snow accumulating on the ground, wind howling through the trees. It was near midnight when a sound cut through the tempest, something different from the wind's wail or the cracking of snow-laden branches. A human sound, a scream. Logan jolted awake, his hand automatically reaching for the revolver he kept beside his pillow. For a moment, he wasn't sure if the scream had been real or just another nightmare bleeding into wakefulness. Then it came again, distant but distinct. A woman's voice, not in terror but in rage, challenging something or someone in the darkness. He sat frozen on the edge of his bed, every instinct telling him to ignore it, to turn away from whatever drama was playing out in the canyon. It wasn't his concern. Nothing was his concern anymore except surviving one day to the next. But the scream came a third time, and with it, an unwelcome memory. Catherine's voice calling his name, and men broke down their door while he was miles away checking his trap lines. A call for help he hadn't been there to answer. "Damn it," Logan muttered, reaching for his boots. He pulled them on, grabbed his heavy coat and hat, and took the Winchester from its place above the door. He hadn't intervened in another person's troubles in 3 years. He'd built his life around the principle of isolation, of non-involvement. Yet here he was stepping out into a snowstorm, following a stranger's cry into the darkness. The snow was falling heavily now, already several inches deep, and concealing the uneven ground beneath. Logan moved carefully but quickly, guided by the sound that had stirred him from his bed. The wind bit through his coat, but he barely felt it. His senses dulled by grief and whiskey in the cabin, sharpened in the wild. This was the only time he felt even remotely alive anymore, in moments of danger when instinct took over and pushed everything else aside. He followed the canyon's edge, tracing a path he knew well enough to navigate even in the dark. The screams had stopped, replaced by other sounds, growls, snarls, the sounds of struggle. As he rounded a bend in the path, the scene revealed itself in the weak moonlight that filtered through breaks in the storm clouds. In a small clearing beside the frozen creek, a woman fought for her life against 3 timber wolves. She wasn't cowering or fleeing, but standing her ground, a long knife in one hand, a broken branch in the other. Blood stained the snow around her, both hers and that of one wolf that lay dead at her feet. The remaining wolves circled her, their ribs visible even beneath their thick winter coats. They were starving, desperate enough to attack a human despite their natural wariness. The woman's back was to Logan, but he could see she wore traditional Apache clothing, her long black hair plaited down her back. As one wolf lunged, she slashed outward with her knife, drawing a yelp as the blade connected. But the distraction cost her. The second wolf darted in from behind, teeth closing around her leg, dragging her down into the snow. Logan raised his rifle without conscious thought, sighting down the barrel as the woman screamed again, that same sound of defiance rather than fear. He squeezed the trigger, and the wolf attacking her leg dropped instantly. The third wolf turned toward the new threat, but another shot rang out and it fled, disappearing into the storm. For a moment, the clearing was silent, except for the woman's labored breathing and the soft hiss of snowflakes landing on the ground. Logan approached cautiously, rifle still ready. The woman had managed to get to her knees, but her leg was bleeding heavily where the wolf's teeth had torn through flesh. Her shoulder was also injured, deep claw marks visible through her torn clothing. As he drew closer, she turned to face him, and Logan felt something like an electrical current run through his body. Her face, illuminated by the intermittent moonlight, was striking: high cheekbones, strong jaw, and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Those eyes fixed on him now with a mixture of wariness and fierce pride. "Stay back," she said in accented but clear English, the knife still gripped tightly in her hand despite her injuries. "You need help," Logan replied, keeping his distance as requested but not lowering his rifle entirely. "Those wounds need tending or you'll bleed out before morning." She glanced down at her leg, then back at him. "I am Apache. We know how to survive." "Not even Apache can survive blood loss and exposure on a night like this," he countered. "My cabin's not far. You can barely stand, let alone walk there yourself." As if to prove his point, she attempted to rise and immediately faltered, pain flashing across her face before she could mask it. Pride warred with practicality in her expression, but the latter eventually won out as she looked at the deepening snow. "Your name," she demanded, not asked. Logan Harrington." She studied him a moment longer, her gaze unnervingly direct. "I am Nara." No family name, no further explanation. Just Nara. "Well, Nara, you have two choices. Die out here or come with me." For a moment, he thought she might choose the first option out of sheer stubbornness, but then she gave a single curt nod. "I will come." Logan approached slowly, set his rifle aside, and crouched beside her. Blood was soaking the snow beneath her, too much blood. Without asking permission, which he suspected would be denied on principle, he swung her up into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, but solid with muscle. Her body went rigid at his touch, and he realized it had probably been as long since she'd been touched by another person as it had been for him. "Put your arms around my neck," he instructed. "It's a rough path back." After a moment's hesitation, she complied, her hand still gripping the knife, its blade dangerously close to his throat. A warning clear as day: help was accepted, trust was not. Logan retrieved his rifle, with one hand cradling Nara against his chest with the other, and began the difficult trek back to his cabin. The storm had intensified, visibility reduced to just a few feet ahead. Only his intimate knowledge of the terrain kept them from plunging over the canyon's edge or becoming lost in the vast wilderness. Nara's blood soaked through his shirt, warm against his skin, the first human warmth he'd felt in 3 years. Her breath came in short gasps against his neck, and occasionally she whispered words in Apache that he couldn't understand. Whether prayers or curses, he couldn't tell. What was clear, though, was that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered world from the moment he'd heard her scream. For reasons he couldn't explain even to himself, Logan Harrington was running faster than he had in years, carrying a bleeding Apache woman through a blizzard back to the sanctuary he'd built to house nothing but his own misery. The irony wasn't lost on him, but with Nara growing heavier and less responsive in his arms, there was no time to dwell on it. By the time they reached the cabin, Nara had lost consciousness, her head lolling against his shoulder, the knife finally slipping from her grasp to disappear in the deep snow. Logan kicked the door open and carried her inside, laying her on the table where he dressed game, the only surface large enough and accessible enough for what needed to be done. Blood pooled beneath her immediately, and for a moment Logan stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sudden intrusion of life and death stakes into his carefully maintained isolation. Then training kicked in, both from his military days and from years of surviving alone in the wilderness. He built up the fire, put water on to boil, and gathered clean rags and the few medical supplies he kept on hand. Nara's eyes rolled beneath closed lids, then suddenly snapped open, locking onto his face with an intensity that made him step back. She tried to speak, choked, then managed a single word in broken English: "Help!" It wasn't a plea so much as a command, and oddly, Logan found himself responding to the authority in her voice. He cut away the torn, blood-soaked clothing from her wounds, revealing the full extent of the damage. 4 deep gashes ran across her right shoulder and down her arm, where claws had torn through flesh. Her left leg was worse, puncture wounds from teeth that had locked on and tried to drag her down. The wolves had been starving, desperate enough to risk attacking a human. He'd seen it in their eyes when he'd charged in rifle raised, heart hammering harder than it had in years. Logan worked methodically, washing the wounds, applying a salve of his own making from local plants, and finally bandaging everything as neatly as his rough hands could manage. Throughout the process, Nara drifted between consciousness and oblivion. But whenever her eyes opened, they fixed on him with that same unnerving stare, not gratitude, not fear, something else entirely. When he'd finished with her wounds, Logan faced another problem. Her clothes were torn, beyond repair, and soaked with blood. He couldn't leave her in them, but the alternative meant another level of intimacy he wasn't prepared for. Awkwardly, he found one of his own shirts and a pair of soft buckskin pants he'd tanned himself. "You need to change," he told her when she was next conscious. "I'll turn my back." Nara nodded weakly and Logan turned away, listening to the rustle of fabric and occasional sharp intake of breath as she struggled to dress herself despite her injuries. After what seemed an eternity, she spoke. "Done." When he turned back, she sat on the edge of the table, swaying slightly, his clothes hanging loose on her smaller frame. Despite her injuries and obvious exhaustion, she somehow maintained an air of dignity that made him feel like the intruder in his own home. "You need rest," Logan said, moving to help her to his bed in the corner. She tensed as he approached, but allowed him to support her as she hobbled across the room. "The bed is yours," he continued. "I'll take the floor." Nara sank onto the bed with barely concealed relief, though her face remained stoic. She looked around the cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, the two plates still sitting on the table, the locked trunk in the corner. Her gaze lingered on the items on the mantelpiece, especially the Border Patrol badge. "You were soldier?" she asked, the words slightly slurred with exhaustion and pain. Logan hesitated. "Border Patrol. Long time ago." Something flickered in her eyes, wariness perhaps, or something deeper, but she was too weak to pursue it. Instead, she asked, "Why you help me?" It was the question he'd been asking himself since he'd first heard her scream. Why break 3 years of carefully maintained isolation? Why risk everything, his solitude, his emotional armor, his carefully constructed routine for a stranger? "Get some rest," he said instead of answering. "We can talk tomorrow." Nara's eyes were already closing, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion and blood loss. But just before sleep claimed her, she whispered, "Tomorrow, you answer." Then she was asleep, leaving Logan alone with the sudden, disorienting realization that his cabin no longer belonged only to ghosts and regrets. For the first time in 3 years, he was sharing his space with another living soul, and he had no idea what to do with that fact. He made a pallet on the floor near the fire, far enough from the bed to give Nara space, but close enough to hear if she needed help in the night. As he lay down, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling, Logan tried to identify the strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't quite anxiety, nor was it completely uncomfortable. It felt disturbingly like the first stirrings of something he'd thought long dead curiosity about another person. Sleep eluded him for hours as he listened to Nara's breathing, wondering what storm he'd invited into his carefully ordered isolation. Dawn came pale and hesitant through the cabin's small windows, the storm having blown itself out sometime in the early morning hours. Logan had finally fallen into a fitful sleep just before sunrise, only to jolt awake at the sound of movement from the bed. Nara was sitting up, her face tight with pain, but her eyes clear and alert. She'd rewrapped some of her bandages, evidently having inspected her wounds while he slept. In the cold light of morning, with blood no longer obscuring her features, Logan could see her more clearly. She was younger than he'd first thought, mid-20s perhaps, with a face that balanced feminine beauty with undeniable strength. Her skin was copper brown, marked here and there with small scars that spoke of a life lived hard and without compromise. Traditional tattoos circled her upper arm, symbols whose meaning he could only guess at. Her black hair, freed from its braid, fell in waves to her waist. But it was her eyes that commanded attention, dark as obsidian, intelligent, and utterly unafraid as they assessed him in return. "You watch me like hunter," she said, breaking the silence. "I am not prey." Logan realized he'd been staring and looked away, moving to stoke the fire. "How's the pain?" "I have known worse." She attempted to stand, winced, but forced herself upright through sheer force of will. Logan resisted the urge to help her, sensing it would not be welcomed. Instead, he busied himself preparing a simple breakfast, cornmeal mush, with dried berries and a strip of jerky. Not much, but it would help replace the blood she'd lost. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the table. You need to eat. Nara made her way slowly to the table, her injured leg dragging slightly. She sat with the careful dignity of royalty, despite being dressed in borrowed clothes in a stranger's cabin. As Logan set the food before her, she glanced at the two empty plates still sitting on the edge of the table. You have family, she asked. Logan stiffened. Had. Something in his tone must have warned her away from that line of questioning because she simply nodded and turned her attention to the food. She ate methodically without apparent enjoyment, but with the focus of someone who understood the necessity of maintaining strength. When she'd finished, she fixed those penetrating eyes on him again. Now you answer. Why you help me? Logan moved to the window, looking out at the fresh blanket of snow covering the clearing around his cabin. In the distance, the mountains rose indifferent to the small dramas playing out in their shadow. How could he explain what he didn't understand himself? I heard you scream, he said, finally, still not looking at her. Couldn't just let you die out there. Many would, white man and Apache. She left a history of violence between their peoples unspoken. I'm not many. No, she agreed, studying him with that unnerving intensity. You are a man who lives like he already dead. Why risk for stranger? The question hit him like a physical blow, partly because of its accuracy, and partly because he'd been asking himself the same thing since he'd first heard her cry in the night. He turned back to face her, leaning against the windowsill. You didn't just scream, he found himself saying. You were fighting, refusing to give up even against those odds. He paused, surprising himself with his next words. It woke something. Nara tilted her head slightly, considering him. The dead part? Maybe. Logan shrugged uncomfortably. He wasn't used to talking anymore, especially not about himself. Your turn. What were you doing out there in a snowstorm? Now it was Nara who looked away, her expression closing. I travel alone. Wolves find me. End of story. Apache don't usually travel alone in winter, especially not women, Logan said, revealing more knowledge of her people than he'd intended. Her eyes narrowed. You know Apache ways border patrol, he reminded her. You learn things working the territory. She seemed to accept this explanation, though wariness lingered in her gaze. I leave my people. My choice. Oh, no. Weisfall, my reasons, she replied firmly. Not your business. Fair enough, Logan thought. He had his secrets. She was entitled to hers. Still, there was something strange about finding an Apache woman alone in the dead of winter, far from any settlement or camp. The territory was dangerous enough for a well-armed white man. For a lone Apache woman, it was nearly suicidal, unless she'd had no choice. You running from something? He asked, keeping his tone neutral. Or someone? Nara's jaw tightened. I said not your business. Becomes my business when I bring you into my home, Logan countered. If trouble's following you, I need to know. For a long moment, she just stared at him, clearly debating how much to reveal. Finally, she sighed. I refuse marriage my father arranged. I leave rather than accept. It wasn't the whole truth. Logan had interrogated enough people in his border patrol days to recognize the signs of partial disclosure, but it was likely part of it. Arranged marriages were common in many tribes, and a woman refusing such an arrangement would indeed have reason to flee. Your father, Logan said slowly, he important man. Again that flicker of wariness. He is chief. That explained the regal bearing, the natural authority in her voice. The daughter of a chief would have been raised to command a lead. It also complicated matters significantly. If her father was a chief, he would not take his daughter's disappearance lightly. There would be people looking for her. They'll come for you, Logan said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Nara agreed, but not yet. Storm covers tracks, and they think I go south toward Mexico border. Not here. She gestured to the surrounding mountains. Logan wondered if that was by design or chance. Had she deliberately headed in an unexpected direction, or had the wolves driven her off course? Either way, it bought them some time, but not much. When you're healed, you'll need to move on, he said more harshly than he'd intended. I don't want Apache warriors at my door. Something like amusement flickered in Nara's eyes. You afraid of Apache? I'm fond of my scalp, if that's what you're asking. Apache not take scalps, that Comanche. The corner of her mouth twitched. But we take other things. Logan wasn't sure if she was joking or threatening him and decided not to find out. He moved to check her bandages, needing something practical to focus on. Let me see those wounds. Nara hesitated, then extended her injured arm. Logan carefully unwrapped the bandage, relieved to see the gashes weren't showing signs of infection. The edges were clean, and though the wounds were deep, they would heal with proper care. As he worked, he noticed a cord around Nara's neck disappearing beneath the collar of the borrowed shirt. He thought nothing of it until she shifted and something slipped out, a small piece of cloth, dirty and frayed but recognizable as part of a military-issue bandana. The pattern was distinctive, the kind issued to Border Patrol units years ago. Logan froze, his fingers suddenly clumsy as he secured the fresh bandage. That bandana, or rather that small piece of one, shouldn't have been in the possession of an Apache woman. It could have been scavenged, of course, or taken from a dead soldier, but something about the way Nara quickly tucked it back out of sight suggested it held greater significance. A cold feeling settled in his stomach as possibilities began to form in his mind. How old had she said she was? Where had she come from? What if— No. He shut down that line of thinking immediately. The territory was vast, conflicts between settlers and natives frequent. The coincidence of finding an Apache woman with a scrap of Border Patrol uniform meant nothing. But as he moved to check the wounds on her leg, Logan caught Nara watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, calculation perhaps, or suspicion. She'd noticed his reaction to the bandana, and now she was assessing him anew. They were both keeping secrets, it seemed, and Logan had the uneasy feeling that those secrets might be on a collision course. For 3 days, the snow continued to fall intermittently, sealing Logan and Nara in their uneasy cohabitation. The forced proximity created a strange rhythm, periods of tense silence, broken by brief, careful conversations. They circled each other like wary animals sharing a den against their better judgment, bound by circumstance rather than choice. Nara's wounds began to heal with remarkable speed. By the second day, she was able to move around the cabin without assistance, though her limp remained pronounced. By the third, she was asking, or rather demanding, to help with chores, unwilling to be a passive recipient of Logan's reluctant hospitality. "I'm not helpless," she declared, taking the knife from his hand as he prepared to skin a rabbit for their dinner. Logan stepped back, watching with grudging admiration as she deftly completed the task he'd begun, her movements efficient despite her injuries. She'd done this before many times. "You hunt?" he asked. "Since I was child," she replied, not looking up from her work. "My father teach me, though not custom for women." A small smile touched her lips. "I'm not good at following custom." "So I gathered," Logan said dryly, thinking of her refusal to accept an arranged marriage. As Nara worked, Logan observed the efficiency in her movements. The woman who had fought wolves with such ferocity now demonstrated equal skill with domestic tasks. Her hands moved with practiced precision, revealing years of self-sufficiency that matched his own. "Tell me about your people," he said, surprising himself with the request. When was the last time he'd asked anyone about themselves? Nara glanced up, equally surprised. "Why you want know?" Logan shrugged. "Odd. Passes the time." She seemed to consider this, then nodded. "My people are Mescalero Apache. We live in mountains south of here near border. Once we roam free all this territory." She gestured expansively. "Now we stay in one place. Government says we must." The reservation, Logan murmured, familiar with the complicated and often tragic history of the Apache people. "Yes, reservation." She spoke the word with distaste. "Small place for people who once had all the mountains." She resumed skinning the rabbit, her movements slightly sharper than before. "My father tried to make peace with white government, sign treaties. Some call him traitor. But he do what he must for people to survive." Logan heard the defensive note in her voice, the complicated pride. "And the man you were supposed to marry," Nara's expression darkened. "Hototo, strong warrior, respected hunter, but," she hesitated, "but he has darkness in him, anger that never sleep." She set down the knife, her task complete. "He lose family and raid many years ago. Now he hate all white men, want war, not peace." "And your father wants you to marry this man?" Logan asked, confused. "If he's working for peace with the government, marriage would bring Hototo's people to our side," Nara explained. "Make tribes stronger, united." She looked at Logan directly. I am price of peace, and you refused. I refuse to be property, she corrected sharply. I refuse man who see me only as chief's daughter, not as Nara. Logan understood better than he wanted to. Politics and arranged marriages weren't so different among white settlers, just dressed in different clothing, justified with different words. The human impulse to use women as bargaining chips seemed universal. What will you do now, he asked. You can't stay in these mountains forever. Why not, Nara challenged. You do. The observation struck uncomfortably close to home. That's different. Is it? Those piercing eyes saw too much. You hide from world. I hide from future I not choose. Same, I think. Before Logan could respond, Nara suddenly tensed her head, turning sharply toward the door. He hadn't heard anything, but he'd learned to trust the instincts of those who lived closer to the land than he ever had. What is it? He asked softly, reaching for his rifle. Horse, Nara whispered. Coming this way. One rider. Logan moved silently to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. Sure enough, a lone horseman was approaching through the snow, following the barely visible trail to his cabin. The horse was struggling in the deep drifts, and the rider was hunched against the cold, a heavy coat and hat obscuring his features. Stay inside, Logan told Nara, checking that his revolver was loaded. If there's trouble, I fight beside you, she interrupted fiercely. Not hide like child. Despite the tension of the moment, Logan felt an unexpected surge of respect for this woman who, injured as she was, refused to cower. But there wasn't time to argue the point. The rider was nearly at the cabin now. Logan stepped onto the porch, rifle ready, but not aimed, as the horseman reined to a stop in the clearing. For a long moment, they regarded each other in silence. Then the rider pushed back his hat, revealing the weathered face of an old man, white-bearded, with the hard eyes of someone who had seen too much of the world's brutality. That's close enough, Logan called out. State your business. The old man raised his empty hands to show he meant no harm. Name's Jeremiah Walsh. I trap these parts. His voice was rough with age and tobacco. Saw smoke from your chimney. Didn't know anyone was living out here. Logan kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he cursed. He'd been careful to build his cabin where the chimney smoke would be dispersed by the canyon winds, minimizing the chance of detection. But the heavy snow and still air of the past few days had made concealment impossible. Logan Harrington, he replied curtly. I value my privacy. Walsh nodded, understanding the unspoken message. Don't blame you. World's gone to hell out there. He glanced at the cabin behind Logan, then back. Just passing through, checking my lines. Storm drove me off course. He hesitated. Don't suppose you'd spare a cup of coffee before I head back? Every instinct told Logan to send the man on his way, but that would only arouse suspicion. Better to appear grudgingly hospitable than dangerously secretive. Besides, the old trapper might have news of search parties, perhaps looking for a chief's daughter. Coffee's hot, Logan said, lowering his rifle slightly. You can come in, but I warn you, I'm not much for conversation. Walsh chuckled dryly. Makes two of us, then. Logan glanced back through the open door, giving Nara a warning look. She stood just inside, a knife held low against her leg, ready but not threatening. She gave a small nod, understanding the need for caution. As Walsh dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail, Logan wondered if he was making a terrible mistake. 3 years of perfect isolation broken twice in a single week. First by an Apache woman fleeing an arranged marriage, and now by an aging trapper who might bring unwanted attention to his sanctuary. The solitude he'd built his life around was crumbling, and Logan couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of unwelcome changes. Jeremiah Walsh removed his snow-crusted hat and coat, hanging them by the door before entering the cabin proper. His sharp eyes took in the interior with a trapper's attention to detail, lingering briefly on Nara before returning to Logan. Didn't realize you had company, he said, his tone carefully neutral, but his meaning clear. A white man living alone with an Apache woman raised questions. She was injured, Logan said flatly. Wolves, I found her in the canyon during the storm. Walsh nodded slowly, as if this explained everything and nothing. Apache, ain't she long way from the reservation? Nara, who had moved to the far side of the room, spoke up. I understand your words, old man. No need speak of me like I not here. Walsh had the decency to look abashed. No offense meant, miss. Logan gestured to the table. Sit. Coffee's there. He remained standing, unwilling to settle into the false camaraderie of shared refreshment. What news from outside? Walsh eased his old bones onto one of the chairs, wrapping gnarled hands around the mug Logan provided. Armies pushing Apache farther south. New settlers coming in from the east, thinking to farm this country. He shook his head. Fools, this ain't farming's land. Any trouble? Logan pressed. Raids conflicts. The old man sipped his coffee before answering. Tensions are high. There's talk of some Apache bands rejecting the treaties, wanting to fight. His gaze shifted briefly to Nara. Particularly one group led by a warrior they call Hototo. Nasty piece of work from what I hear. Logan didn't miss how Nara stiffened at the name, though her face remained impassive. So the man she'd refused to marry was indeed making waves beyond the reservation. Interesting. Anything else? Logan asked, keeping his tone casual. Walsh hesitated, then leaned forward. There is one thing, though it may be just trappers' tales. Been hearing about a group operating in these mountains, white men heavily armed. Not army, not law. He lowered his voice. Some say they're hunting Apache for bounty. Bounty? Logan frowned. Government stopped paying for Apache scalps years ago. Not government bounty, Walsh clarified. Private. There's rumors some wealthy ranchers down south lost family to raids. They're paying for retribution, dead Apache, no questions asked. Logan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. He'd heard of such things during his Border Patrol days, unofficial justice that was nothing more than sanctioned murder. He glanced at Nara, who was listening intently, her expression giving nothing away. You seen any sign of these men? Logan asked. Walsh shook his head. Just their handiwork. Found a small Apache hunting party about 20 miles south of here last month. All dead and not clean deaths. His eyes grew distant with the memory. Whoever did it enjoyed their work. The implications hung heavy in the air. If such men were operating in these mountains, Nara was in even more danger than she'd realized when she fled the reservation. And now, so was Logan, simply by harboring her. Walsh finished his coffee and stood. I've said more than I meant to. Just thought you should know, living out here alone. He glanced again at Nara. Or not so alone. Logan walked the old trapper to the door, retrieving his coat and hat. Appreciate the warning. Walsh paused at the threshold. Word of advice, Harrington Apache woman all alone. He shook his head. There'll be others looking for her, and they won't all weigh as friendly as me. Whatever your arrangement is, it might be safer to end it. Noted, Logan said coldly. Safe travels. Walsh. The old man nodded, ducked out into the snow, and mounted his horse. Logan watched until he disappeared into the swirling flakes, then secured the door and turned to face Nara, who had moved to stand by the fire. He knows too much, she said quietly. About Hototo. About me. He's a trapper. They hear things. No. Nara shook her head firmly. He know too specific, and he watch me like he recognize. She met Logan's gaze directly. He will tell others I am here. Logan couldn't disagree. While Walsh hadn't seemed openly hostile, he was clearly a man who survived by trading. In more than just furs, information was currency in the territory. If your people come looking, they'll find you, he said. And if these bounty hunters are real, they'll find you too. Either way, you can't stay. Something flashed in Nara's eyes, hurt quickly, masked by pride. I leave when I choose. Not when white men tell me. This isn't about race, Logan snapped. It's about survival. Yours and mine. I built this place to be invisible, and in less than a week you've brought danger to my door. I not ask you, save me, Nara fired back, her accent thickening with emotion. I fight wolves alone. Would die alone if needed. Then why didn't you, Logan demanded. Why did you call for help? I not call for help, I fight. She stepped toward him, wincing as her injured leg protested, but refusing to back down. You came because you choose, not because I ask. She was right, and they both knew it. Logan had made a choice that night, the first real choice he'd made in 3 years that wasn't about simple survival. He'd chosen to involve himself in another person's fate, and now he was facing the consequences of that decision. Fine, he said after a moment, his voice quieter. But the fact remains this cabin isn't safe anymore. For either of us. Nara studied him, her anger fading into something more contemplative. You afraid, she observed. Logan stiffened. I'm cautious. There's a difference. No. She shook her head slowly. You afraid of living again, of feeling, of caring what happened to another person. She touched the scrap of bandana at her neck almost unconsciously. What make you dead inside Logan Harrington? What you run from in these mountains? The question hung in the air between them, too direct to deflect, too perceptive to dismiss. For a brief, disorienting moment, Logan considered telling her everything about Catherine and Emily, about the raiders he'd hunted down and killed, about the emptiness that had followed his vengeance. For 3 years, he'd spoken to no one but ghosts. The prospect of unburdening himself to a living person was suddenly irrationally tempting. Instead, he turned away. Get some rest. Your leg needs more healing before you can travel. He felt rather than saw Nara's disappointment at his evasion, but she didn't press further. And you, what will you do? Logan moved to the window, scanning the fortress line for any sign of Walsh's return, or worse, the companions he might bring. I'll keep watch, just in case our visitor decides to come back with friends. As night fell, Logan maintained his vigil at the window, while Nara eventually retired to the bed. The snow continued to fall, erasing Walsh's tracks, burying any evidence of his visit beneath a fresh, pristine blanket of white. It should have been reassuring, this natural concealment, but Logan couldn't shake the feeling of approaching danger. Something was changing, not just in his carefully ordered existence, but in himself. The presence of another person after so long alone was awakening sensations he'd thought permanently deadened. Concern for someone other than himself. Awareness of another's pain. The complicated dance of conversation, of reading expressions and responding to unspoken cues. It was exhausting. It was terrifying. And yet in the stillness of the night, watching Nara's features softened by sleep, a forgotten sensation stirred within him. Not just survival instinct, but something more fundamental, a reminder of connection, of purpose beyond mere existence. He turned back to the window rifle across his knees and prepared for a long night of watchful waiting. Outside, the snow fell silently, covering the world in a deceptive peace that Logan Harrington knew better than to trust. Morning arrived with a troubling discovery. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a crystalline day sunlight sparkling off pristine snow. Logan, who had dozed fitfully in his chair by the window, was awakened by Nara's hand on his shoulder, a touch so unexpected that he nearly pulled his knife before recognizing her throw. Tracks, she said, simply gesturing toward the window. Logan rose stiffly, muscles protesting after the long night of watchfulness, and peered out. In the clear morning light, he could see what had caught Nara's attention. A line of tracks, not Walsh's, these were fresher, made after the snow had stopped, circled the clearing around his cabin. Whoever had made them had been careful to stay within the tree line, using the pines for cover as they surveyed the cabin. How many? Logan asked, mentally cataloging the weapons at his disposal. Nara frowned. 3, maybe 4 men. Hard to tell. They careful walk in each other's footsteps when they can. Her expression was grim. Not Apache way. Apache walk silent, not leave tracks. White men, then, Logan concluded. Walsh didn't waste any time spreading the word. Or he was followed, Nara suggested. Old trapper make easy trail to follow in snow. Either way, the implications were clear. Their sanctuary had been compromised. Logan moved quickly around the cabin, gathering essentials, ammunition, dried food, medical supplies, and stuffing them into a saddlebag. We need to leave, he said, not looking at Nara. If those men are the bounty hunters Walsh mentioned, they'll be back with reinforcements. To his surprise, Nara didn't argue. She had already begun packing her few possessions, the clothes she'd been wearing when he found her, now mended as best she could manage, and the knife she'd carried, which Logan had retrieved from the snow and returned to her. Where we go? She asked, and Logan noted the we with a mixture of resignation and something else he couldn't quite name. There's an old line cabin about 10 miles west of here, he said after a moment's consideration. Used by trappers in the deep winter. Should be abandoned this time of year. Nara nodded, but her expression remained troubled. You're home, she said, gesturing around the cabin. All you build, you leave because of me. There was something like guilt in her voice, and Logan found himself oddly moved by her concern. 3 years he'd spent building this place, making it his fortress against the world. Now he was abandoning it without a second thought. Just walls and a roof, he said gruffly. Can build again somewhere else if needed. The lie came easily, but they both recognized it for what it was. This cabin was more than shelter. It was the physical manifestation of Logan's grief, built with the same meticulous care with which he'd constructed the walls around his heart. Leaving it was not a simple matter of relocating. Still, as he gathered the few precious items, he couldn't bear to leave behind Catherine's hairbrush, Emily's wooden horse, his journal. Logan realized something unexpected. The crushing weight of isolation that had defined his existence for 3 years felt marginally lighter. Not gone, not even substantially diminished, but different somehow. Perhaps it was simply the urgency of their situation, the need to focus on immediate survival rather than past losses. Or perhaps it was the presence of another person who needed him, not just his reluctant hospitality, but his knowledge, his skills, his protection. Whatever the reason, as Logan shouldered his rifle and led Nara out into the blinding white landscape, he moved with a purpose that had been absent from his life for too long. They traveled slowly, hampered by Nara's injuries and the need to maintain vigilance. Logan led his horse loaded with their supplies, while Nara walked beside him, stubbornly refusing his occasional offers to let her ride. Her pride was a tangible thing, as much a part of her as her dark eyes or her quiet strength. "You still weak from blood loss," he argued when she stumbled for the third time in an hour. "Being stubborn won't get us to the cabin any faster." "I walk," she insisted, her jaw set in a determined line. "Horse carry supplies, not me." Logan bit back his frustration. "At least let me help you." After a moment's hesitation, Nara allowed him to support her with an arm around her waist, though the concession clearly cost her. They continued this way, an awkward three-legged creature lurching through the snow, making slow but steady progress toward the distant tree line where the line cabin waited. The sun climbed higher, turning the snow-covered landscape into a sea of blinding white. Logan kept his eyes on the horizon, alert for any sign of movement, any hint that they were being followed. Beside him, Nara's breathing grew increasingly labored, though she made no complaint. "Need to rest," he said finally, as much for her sake as his own. "There's a sheltered spot ahead by those rocks." Nara didn't argue, which told Logan more about her condition than any words could have. They made their way to the rocky outcropping, where the snow had drifted less deeply, and Logan helped her sit with her back against the sun-warmed stone. As he unpacked a water skin and some jerky, he caught Nara studying him with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see more than he wanted to reveal. "What?" he asked, more defensively than he'd intended. "You not like most white men," she said simply. "You move like Apache, silent, always watching." Logan handed her the water skin. "Border Patrol teaches you to move carefully in hostile territory." "Not just that," Nara persisted. "You know land, know how to live with it, not fight against it." She took a sip of water. Unusual for white man. There was a compliment buried in her observation, though Logan wasn't sure how to accept it. He'd spent years learning the ways of the land, first as a young Border Patrol officer, then as a homesteader with Catherine, and finally as a solitary hunter, seeking only to survive. The wilderness had been his teacher, often a harsh one. "The land doesn't care what color your skin is," he said finally. "It'll kill you just the same if you don't respect it." Nara smiled slightly, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. True words. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the occasional call of a winter bird and the soft whicker of the horse as it pawed at the snow, searching for grass beneath. "Your wife," Nara said suddenly, "the brush on your fireplace. It was hers." Logan stiffened, his food forgotten. "Yes." "And the small horse. For your child." "My daughter, Emily." The names felt strange on his tongue after so long speaking only to ghosts. "She was 6. Nara's expression softened. "What happened to them?" Logan stood abruptly, moving away from the rocks, unable to bear the weight of her compassion. He'd carried his grief alone for so long that sharing it felt like a betrayal, as if speaking of Catherine and Emily to another person somehow diminished the sanctity of their memory. But something in Nara's quiet patience and the simple dignity with which she bore her own pain broke through his defenses. "Raiders," he said, his back still to her. "3 years ago, I was checking trap lines, gone 2 days. His voice grew rougher. "When I came back, the house was burned. They were inside." He heard Nara's soft intake of breath, but she didn't offer empty condolences or platitudes. Instead, after a moment, she asked, "The men who did this, you find them?" Logan turned slowly to face her, surprised by the question. Not "I'm sorry" or "how terrible," but a direct inquiry that assumed action rather than passive suffering. He realized, a very Apache way of thinking. Grief was private, justice was a communal concern. I found them, he confirmed, his voice flat. 7 men. Took me a year to track them all down. And, Nara prompted, and they're dead. Logan met her gaze unflinchingly, waiting for judgment or horror. All 7. Instead, Nara nodded as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Blood for blood. Apache understand this law. The simple acceptance in her words loosened something tight in Logan's chest. For 3 years he'd carried not only his grief, but the weight of his vengeance. The knowledge that he had hunted men like animals, had killed them without mercy or hesitation. He had never regretted it, but he had understood that the society he'd once been part of would condemn him for taking justice into his own hands. But here in this desolate, snow-covered wilderness, sitting across from a woman whose culture recognized the ancient law of retribution, Logan felt a measure of peace he hadn't expected. We should keep moving, he said after a moment, offering his hand to help Nara to her feet. Still have a long way to go before dark. She accepted his assistance with a small nod of acknowledgement, not for the help itself, but for what he had shared, a confidence given and received with the gravity it deserved. As they resumed their journey, Logan found himself wondering about the small piece of Border Patrol bandana Nara wore around her neck. What blood debt did it represent? What justice did she seek? And why did he increasingly feel that their paths had crossed for reasons beyond mere chance? The line cabin came into view just as the winter sun began its early descent toward the western mountains. It was a crude structure more substantial than a lean-to, but far less refined than Logan's own cabin. Built of rough-hewn logs chinked with moss and mud, it offered basic shelter for trappers caught in the deep wilderness during the worst of winter. Logan approached cautiously, rifle ready, while Nara hung back with the horse. The cabin appeared deserted, no smoke from the chimney, no tracks in the fresh snow surrounding it. Still, appearances could be deceiving. He circled the structure, once checking for signs of recent habitation before finally approaching the door. It wasn't locked. There was little need for locks in the wilderness, but a simple wooden bar on the inside kept wildlife from entering. Logan pushed the door open, wincing at the groan of unused hinges. The interior was dark and musty, but mercifully empty. A small stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and filled with old ashes. A rough plank table, 2 stools, and a crude bed frame, covered with a moldering mattress of pine boughs, completed the furnishings. Not comfortable, but it would provide shelter until they determined their next move. Logan went back outside, gesturing to Nara that it was safe to approach. Together, they led the horse to a small lean-to attached to the cabin's rear, where it would have some protection from the elements. Not much, Logan acknowledged as they entered the cabin with their supplies. But it'll keep the snow off. Nara looked around the dim interior, her expression unreadable. It have walls, it have roof, it good enough. Logan set about making the space habitable, clearing old debris from the fireplace, gathering fresh pine boughs for the bed, unpacking their meager supplies. Nara joined him without being asked, working alongside him with quiet efficiency despite her injuries. There was a natural rhythm to their movements, a wordless coordination that came from 2 people accustomed to self-reliance now working toward a common goal. By the time darkness fell, they had a small fire burning in the hearth, casting warm light and dancing shadows across the cabin's interior. Logan had fashioned a crude pallet on the floor for himself, insisting that Nara take the freshly prepared bed. After a token protest more for the sake of her pride than out of any real objection, she had agreed. They ate a simple meal of jerky, dried berries, and cornbread Logan had brought from his cabin, supplemented with pine needle tea for warmth. The silence between them was no longer tense but companionable, the quiet of people who had reached a tacit understanding. Tomorrow I hunt, Nara said as they finished their meal. Need fresh meat. Logan frowned. Your wounds? Heal enough, she interrupted firmly. I not sit idle while you do all work. I hunt, you gather wood. Fair trade. He wanted to argue but recognized the determination in her tone. Nara was not someone who accepted limitations easily, even those imposed by her own body. And in truth, they would need fresh game if they planned to stay at the line cabin for any significant time. Fine, he conceded, but you take the rifle. Nara raised an eyebrow. You trust Apache with your gun? I trust you, Logan said simply, surprising himself with the truth of the statement. When had that happened? When had this woman moved from dangerous complication to trusted companion in his mind? Something flickered in Nara's eyes, surprise perhaps, or something deeper. She touched the piece of bandana at her neck, a gesture he'd noticed she made when thinking or troubled. That scrap of cloth, Logan said, seizing the opening. It means something to you. Nara stilled her expression, closing like a door shutting. Yes. Military issue, he continued carefully. Border patrol from the pattern. She met his gaze steadily but said nothing. Where did you get it? He pressed. For a long moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then with deliberate movements she untied the cord from around her neck and held the scrap of fabric in her palm, staring down at it as if it might reveal secrets. 15 years ago, she said, her voice low and controlled. Soldiers come to my village, not regular army, border patrol. They burn everything, kill many people. Her eyes lifted to his, dark with old pain. My mother hid me under brush and dirt. She died protecting me. Logan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He knew of such atrocities, unofficial pacification missions that were nothing more than massacres carried out by rogue elements within the Border Patrol. They were spoken of in hushed tones, denied officially, but known to exist nonetheless. One soldier find me, Nara continued. He not like others. He have, she struggled for the word, shame in his eyes. He take me away from burning village, save my life. Her fingers closed around the scrap of fabric. This from his uniform. Only thing I have to remember him, to find him someday. The implications hung in the air between them. Logan's mind raced through calculations of time and place. 15 years ago, he would have been a young officer newly assigned to the territory. He had never participated in such raids, had in fact reported his suspicions about certain officers to his superiors to little effect. But he had known of them, had heard rumors, had perhaps even known the men involved. Why would you want to find him? He asked carefully. This man who was part of a group that destroyed your village. He different, Nara insisted. He saved me when others kill. He have good heart under soldier uniform. She paused, her gaze intensifying. I need to know why. Why he part of such men yet act with kindness. Need to understand. Logan looked away, unable to bear the weight of her stare. There was something in her story that nagged at him, a splinter in his mind he couldn't quite grasp. The timing, the location. It could be coincidence. It had to be coincidence. And if you find him, he asked, what then? Not sure, Nara admitted. Maybe kill him, maybe thank him. A small, sad smile touched her lips. Maybe both. The honesty of her answer was startling and oddly reassuring. Whatever else Nara might be, she was not someone who dealt in half-truths or comfortable lies. After my father find me, she continued, he'd take me back to our people, raise me to be strong, to lead someday. Her expression hardened, but always in my heart I carry this. She held up the scrap of bandana. Reminder that even enemies can show mercy, that people not always what they seem. Logan nodded slowly, understanding better now. Why Nara was different from other Apache he had encountered. Why she carried herself with the authority of a leader, but the perspective of an outsider. She had been marked by her experience, shaped by the dual influences of her father's leadership and the traumatic compassion of a stranger. And this man you were to marry, Logan said, making connections. Hototo, he lost family in a raid as well. Yes, Nara confirmed, but he let hate consume him, become all he is. Her eyes held Logan's, searching. You understand this path. You follow it when you hunt men who kill your family. It wasn't a question, but Logan felt compelled to answer anyway. Yes, for a time vengeance was all I had, all I wanted. And after when last man die by your hand. What then? Logan looked into the fire, remembering the hollow emptiness that had followed his final act of retribution. Nothing, just nothing. He glanced back at her. That's when I came here, built the cabin, tried to disappear. From world or from yourself? The question struck too close to home. Logan stood abruptly, moving to the cabin's single window, peering out at the moonlit snow. It's late. We should rest if we're hunting tomorrow. He felt rather than saw Nara's nod of acquiescence. She understood boundaries, respected the need for privacy, even in this confined space. Another quality that made her presence unexpectedly tolerable. As Logan settled onto his pallet, listening to Nara's breathing gradually slow into the rhythm of sleep, he found his mind returning to her story. A young Apache girl hidden by her dying mother, found by a Border Patrol officer with shame in his eyes, saved when others were killed. The splinter in his mind drove deeper, becoming a thorn he couldn't ignore. There was something familiar about the story, something that resonated with his own experiences. But the connection remained elusive, hovering just beyond the reach of conscious memory. Sleep, when it finally came, was filled with fractured images, burning villages, screaming women, and a small child looking up at him with eyes that somehow knew him better than he knew himself. Logan awakened before dawn, an old habits dying hard even in unfamiliar surroundings. For a moment he was disoriented, the line cabin's rough interior unfamiliar after 3 years in his own carefully constructed home. Then memory returned, the tracks around his cabin, the hasty departure, the long trek through snow, and Nara's story by firelight. He sat up, glancing toward the bed where she should have been sleeping. It was empty, the pine bough mattress neatly arranged as if she had been gone for some time. Alarm shot through him. Had she left in the night, decided to continue her journey alone, or worse, had someone found them? Logan was on his feet, instantly reaching for his rifle, only to find it missing as well. His initial panic turned to confused relief when he noticed the cabin door was barred from the inside. Wherever Nara had gone, she hadn't left the cabin. The mystery was solved a moment later when the door opened and Nara entered, rifle in one hand, a string of rabbits in the other. Frost rimed her hair and clothing, her breath visible in the cold air she brought with her. "You hunt already," Logan said, stating the obvious. "Before sunrise." Nara's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "Best time. Animals not expect hunter so early." She held up the rabbits. "Breakfast." Logan stared at her, torn between admiration and irritation. She had taken his rifle without permission, had gone hunting alone despite her injuries, had risked exposure and discovery, and had succeeded where many experienced hunters would have failed. "You're either very brave," he said slowly, "or very foolish." Nara smiled, a real smile that transformed her solemn face. "Why not both?" She handed him the rifle. "I clean rabbits. You make fire. Then we talk about what come next." The simple domesticity of the scene, Nara expertly skinning and dressing the rabbits outside, while Logan rebuilt the fire and prepared a crude spit, struck Logan as surreal after so long alone. There was a comfortable efficiency to their division of labor, a natural complementarity that required little discussion. It was not unpleasant. They ate in companionable silence, savoring the fresh meat after days of jerky and dried provisions. Only when they had finished and Logan was brewing pine needle tea did Nara return to her earlier promise of discussion. "The men who track your cabin," she said, "they will keep looking." Logan nodded grimly. "Walsh might have told them about you. If they're the bounty hunters he mentioned, they won't give up easily. And if they Apache warriors sent by Hototo," Nara's expression darkened, "they also not give up." It was a sobering assessment. They faced potential threats from two directions: white bounty hunters who would kill Nara for profit, and Apache warriors who would forcibly return her to a marriage she had rejected. "We can't stay here indefinitely," Logan acknowledged. "Line cabins too well known among trappers. Sooner or later someone will come." "So we keep moving," Nara suggested, "further into mountains." Logan considered this. The deep wilderness offered concealment, but also increased danger, harsher conditions, more difficult hunting, and the risk of becoming truly lost if a storm hit. And ultimately, it was only a temporary solution. Winter wouldn't last forever, and with spring would come increased activity throughout the territory. "You could go back," he said finally, "to your people. Explain to your father why you can't marry Hototo." Nara's expression hardened. "Already try. Father say tribe need alliance Hototo's people bring. Need strong warriors to protect against white settlers." She shook her head firmly. "He not listen." "And your father," Logan pressed in, "he's a reasonable man, otherwise he cares for you." "Yes," Nara admitted. "He loved me, but she first, father second. Always think of tribe before family." It was a familiar dilemma: individual happiness, sacrifice for collective security. Logan had seen it play out in countless ways during his Border Patrol days, on both sides of the cultural divide. "There might be a third option," he said slowly, thinking aloud. "If what Walsh said is true about these bounty hunters, they're operating outside the law. The Army doesn't sanction private warfare against peaceful tribes." Nara's eyes narrowed. "What you saying? I'm saying that if we can find proof of these bounty hunters, who they are, who's paying them, we might be able to use that information. Bring it to the authorities or, he hesitated, then continued, or to your father. Show him the real threat isn't white settlers in general, but specific men acting outside the law. And this help, how, Nara asked skeptically, it gives your father an alternative, a way to protect the tribe without the alliance with Hototo. Logan leaned forward. If these bounty hunters are targeting Apache regardless of tribal affiliation, Hototo's people are at risk too. It becomes a common threat, something that requires cooperation, not just fighting. Nara considered this, turning the idea over in her mind. You think like peacemaker, not warrior, she observed. Unusual. I've seen enough fighting to know it rarely solves anything permanently, Logan replied. Your father sounds like a man who understands that too. Perhaps, Nara agreed cautiously, but how we find these men, how we'll get proof? It was a valid question. Two people alone in the wilderness, one of them an Apache woman who would be instantly targeted, the other a recluse with no connections to the outside world. They weren't exactly well positioned for an investigation. Before Logan could respond, a sound outside the cabin froze them both, the distant but unmistakable crunch of snow under boots. Someone was approaching and taking little care to conceal their presence. Logan grabbed his rifle, motioning Nara toward the back of the cabin, where a small window might serve as an escape route if needed. She moved silently, her own knife already in hand. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied now by the sound of voices, multiple people making no attempt to hide their approach. Not hunters, then, who would value the element of surprise, but not necessarily friendly either. Logan Harrington, a voice called out. We know you're in there. Come out and talk. Logan exchanged a glance with Nara, who had positioned herself beside the window, ready to flee or fight as necessary. The voice wasn't immediately familiar, but the fact that they knew his name was troubling. Who's asking? Logan called back, keeping his rifle trained on the door. James Crawford, the voice replied. Former Border Patrol. We served together, Harrington. Come out and talk. We mean no harm. The name hit Logan like a physical blow. James Crawford, a man he had indeed served with in the Border Patrol, but not someone he would call a friend. Crawford had been part of a faction within the patrol that Logan had always regarded with suspicion, men who took a harder line with the native populations than regulations allowed, who sometimes returned from patrols with trophies that regulations strictly forbade. Crawford was also, if Logan's suspicions were correct, exactly the type of man who might now be involved in bounty hunting. Nara must have sensed his tension because she moved closer, her voice barely a whisper. You know this man? Yes, Logan confirmed grimly. And if he's here, it's not good news. Harrington, Crawford called again. Don't make this difficult. The old trapper told us you've got an Apache woman in there. We just want to talk to her. Logan's jaw tightened. Walsh had indeed spread the word, and quickly too. But why was Crawford specifically interested in Nara? Was it just the bounty or something more? Send your men away, Logan called back. You come in alone, unarmed, and we'll talk. There was a pause, then a laugh. Always were the cautious one, weren't you? Fine. Just me, no weapons. But my men stay close. Insurance, you understand. Logan turned to Nara. You should hide, or go out the back window while I distract them. Her expression was resolute. No, I stay. I fight if needed. She touched the scrap of bandana at her neck. These men maybe know something about raid on my village, about soldier who saved me. Logan wanted to argue but recognized the determination in her eyes. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Stay back at least, he conceded. Let me talk to him first. Nara nodded, moving to a position where she would be less visible from the door but could still observe the encounter. Logan took a deep breath, then moved to unbar the cabin door, rifle still ready in his hands. When he swung the door open, James Crawford stood on the threshold, hands raised to shoulder height to show they were empty. He was older than Logan remembered. 15 years had turned his once dark hair mostly gray, added lines to his weather-beaten face, and thickened his once lean frame. But the eyes were the same, cold, calculating, with a hint of cruelty that had always made Logan uneasy. Behind Crawford, at a distance of about 20 yards, 3 men waited, all armed with rifles. They were a rough-looking bunch with the hard expressions of men who live by violence. Logan Harrington, Crawford said, a smile that didn't reach his eyes spreading across his face. Been a long time. Heard you'd gone native living alone in the wilderness. Didn't believe it till Walsh told us where to find you. What do you want, Crawford? Logan asked bluntly, not lowering his rifle. Crawford's smile faded. Straight to business, huh? Fine. We're looking for an Apache woman. Young, strong, probably beautiful, if you like that sort of thing. His eyes moved past Logan, scanning the cabin's interior. Walsh says you've been playing host to such a woman. We'd like to speak with her. Why? Logan demanded. What's your interest in her? Crawford sighed as if disappointed by Logan's lack of cooperation. Let's just say she might have information valuable to certain parties. Information worth quite a bit of money. Bounty hunting, Logan said flatly. That's what you've come to Crawford killing Apache for profit. Now who said anything about killing? Crawford's tone was mock offended. We're just facilitators. We bring interested parties together. His expression hardened. But I won't pretend there isn't money in dead Apache these days. Certain ranchers down south are willing to pay handsomely for retribution. Logan's grip on his rifle tightened. Get off my property, Crawford. There's no Apache woman here. No, Crawford raised an eyebrow. Walsh seemed pretty certain. And those tracks we followed from your cabin tell a different story too. Two people, one limping. Heading straight here. He shook his head. Don't make this difficult, Logan. We're not here for you. Just hand over the woman and we'll be on our way. And if I don't, Crawford's pretense at friendliness dropped entirely. Then things get unpleasant. For both of you. He gestured toward the men waiting behind him. We've got you outnumbered and surrounded. That's not a good position for negotiation. Before Logan could respond, Nara stepped forward from the shadows, her head held high despite the danger. I am here, she said clearly. What you want with me? Crawford's eyes widened slightly at the sight of her, then narrowed with what looked like recognition. Well, if it isn't the chief's daughter herself. Maka's girl, aren't you? Nara's surprise was evident, though she quickly masked it. You know my father? Know of him, Crawford corrected. Man who signed away his people's freedom for peace with the whites. Not popular with the more traditional elements of the Apache. He smiled coldly. Including that warrior who's been tearing up the territory looking for you. Hototo, isn't it? Logan felt Nara tense beside him. What you know of Hototo, she demanded. Only that he's offering a substantial reward for your return, Crawford replied casually. Almost as substantial as what certain other parties would pay for proof of your death. He spread his hands in a gesture of mock helplessness. Puts us in something of a quandary, you understand. Two competing offers, both quite tempting. Logan had heard enough. He raised his rifle, aiming directly at Crawford's chest. You're not taking her anywhere. Not to Hototo, not to your other parties. She's under my protection. Crawford's eyebrows rose. Your protection, my Logan. You have gone native. His expression hardened. But you're not thinking clearly. This woman isn't worth dying for. And make no mistake, that's what will happen if you don't cooperate. You willing to die too, Crawford? Logan asked quietly. Because I promise you'll be the first to fall if your men open fire. A tense silence followed, broken only by the soft sound of wind through the pines and the distant call of a winter bird. Crawford stared at Logan, measuring his resolve while the armed men behind him shifted nervously, awaiting orders. It was Nara who finally broke the impasse, stepping fully alongside Logan, her knife visible in her hand. You border patrol, she said to Crawford, her voice steady. 15 years ago, you there when village burn, when my mother die. Something flickered in Crawford's eyes, surprise quickly masked, followed by a calculating look. Lots of villages burned back then, he said carefully. Retaliation for Apache raids. Can't say I remember any specific one. But his eyes told a different story. There was recognition there and something else, a wariness that hadn't been present before. Nara had struck, whether Crawford admitted it or not. You lie, Nara said flatly. You remember, I see in your eyes. Crawford's expression hardened. You're mistaken, but this conversation is pointless anyway. He stepped back from the doorway. I've tried to be reasonable, Logan. Remember that. He turned to go, then paused, looking back with a cold smile. Oh, and in case you're thinking of running again, don't bother. We found you once, we can find you again. And next time we won't waste time with talk. With that, he walked back to his men. They conferred briefly, then mounted horses Logan hadn't noticed before, partially concealed by the trees. Within minutes, they had ridden away, disappearing into the forest that surrounded the line cabin. Logan closed and barred the door, his mind racing. The encounter had confirmed his worst fears. Crawford was indeed hunting Apache for bounty, and now he knew exactly where to find Nara. But something else troubled, something about the way Crawford had reacted to Nara's question about the village raid. He was there, Nara said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. When my village burned, he knows something. Logan nodded slowly. I think you're right, and he recognized you, though he tried to hide it. But how I was child then, now woman. It was a good question, one that added to the growing unease in Logan's mind. If Crawford had been part of the raid on Nara's village 15 years ago, if he remembered enough to recognize her now as an adult, what else did he remember? What else did he know? And why did Logan himself feel increasingly certain that there was a connection here? He was missing a vital piece of the puzzle that remained just beyond his grasp. We can't stay here, he said, pushing these troubling questions aside for the moment. Crawford's men will be back, and in greater numbers. Nara nodded in agreement. Where we go? Logan considered their options, none of them good. They couldn't return to his cabin. That would be the first place Crawford would look. Going deeper into the wilderness might buy them time, but would eventually lead to a confrontation they couldn't win. And heading towards civilization brought its own dangers for Nara, especially as an Apache woman alone among white settlers. There was, however, one possibility. Risky, perhaps even foolhardy, but it offered their best chance of survival and potentially a resolution to the threat Crawford posed. Your father, Logan said finally, you said he values peace, that he signed treaties with the government. Would he listen if we brought him proof of these bounty hunters? Proof that they're operating outside the law, targeting peaceful Apache? Nara's expression was cautious. Perhaps, but he also man who arranged my marriage to Hototo, who not listen when I say no. We wouldn't be approaching him about the marriage, Logan clarified. Just about Crawford and his men. The threat they posed to all Apache, including Hototo's people. Nara considered this, clearly torn between her estrangement from her father and the potential value of his protection and influence. It dangerous, she said finally. Reservation far. Many white settlements between here and there. And Hototo's men watch all trails to reservation. Dangerous, yes, Logan agreed, but staying here is certain death. At least with your father, there's a chance for protection, for justice against Crawford, maybe even for a new understanding between you. Nara touched the scrap of bandana at her neck, her expression thoughtful. And soldier who saved me, she said quietly. Crawford may know who he is, may lead me to him. Logan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. The pieces were aligning in his mind, forming a pattern he wasn't sure he wanted to see. 15 years ago, a Border Patrol unit led by James Crawford had raided an Apache village. Among the officers was a young man who, in a moment of conscience or compassion, had saved a small girl from the slaughter. Now Crawford was hunting the grown woman that girl had become, while she in turn sought the man who had saved her, a man whose identity remained unknown, but who wore the same uniform as her persecutors. And at the center of this web of past and present stood Logan himself, a former Border Patrol officer who had served with Crawford, who had reported suspicious activities, who had eventually left the service in disgust over exactly the kind of atrocities Crawford embodied. Coincidence? Or something more deliberate? Logan? Nara's voice pulled him from his increasingly troubling thoughts. You think this plan can work? He forced himself to focus on the immediate problem. It's our best chance, he said. We'll leave at first light, head south toward the reservation. Stay off the main trails, avoid settlements where possible. Nara nodded, accepting the plan with the pragmatism of someone accustomed to difficult choices and limited options. Then we rest now, she said. Gather strength for journey. As she turned away to begin preparations for their departure, Logan caught her arm gently. Nara, he said, choosing his words carefully. The soldier who saved you. If we find out who he was, what will you do? She met his gaze steadily, her dark eyes unfathomable. Not know until moment come, she admitted, but need to understand. Need to know why he part of such evil yet show kindness to one child. It was an honest answer, if not a reassuring one. Logan released her arm, watching as she moved about the cabin, gathering their few possessions with efficient movements. There was strength in her, a resilience that went beyond mere physical capability. It was the strength of someone who had survived tragedy, who had been shaped by loss but not defined by it. In that, he realized they were alike, both marked by violence, both seeking something beyond mere survival, some meaning, some purpose that might justify the pain they had endured. As night fell with Crawford's threat hanging over them like a storm cloud, Logan found himself wondering if their journey to the reservation might provide answers to questions he hadn't even known to ask, questions about a past he thought he had left behind and a future he hadn't dared to imagine. They left before dawn, abandoning the line cabin with the first pale light filtering through the eastern peaks. The temperature had dropped overnight, turning the snow crisp and the air brittle. Each breath formed a cloud that hung momentarily before dissipating into the stillness of the winter morning. Logan led the way, rifle-ready eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of movement. Behind him, Nara followed, her limp less pronounced after a night's rest, but still noticeable. They had agreed to travel south toward the Apache reservation, a journey that would take several days under ideal conditions, longer given their need to avoid main trails and settlements. Neither had spoken much since waking. The encounter with Crawford had left them both troubled, though, for different reasons. Nara seemed consumed with the possibility that she was close to finding the soldier who had saved her as a child, while Logan wrestled with increasingly troubling suspicions about his own past and its connection to hers. By midday, they had covered several miles, moving through dense pine forest that provided both cover and challenge. As they stopped to rest, Nara's posture suddenly stiffened. "We're being followed," she said quietly. "Feel it. Someone watch us." Logan had learned to trust her instincts. He surveyed their surroundings, seeing nothing but knowing that meant little. A skilled tracker could remain hidden while maintaining surveillance. "Crawford's men?" he asked. "Maybe," Nara replied, "or Hototo's warriors." The possibility that they were being tracked by Apache scouts rather than Crawford's bounty hunters added a new level of complication. Logan had prepared for conflict with white men. Confronting Apache warriors presented a different set of challenges. "We need to move," Logan decided. "Change direction, see if we can draw them out or lose them." Nara nodded. "East, toward river. Ground rocky there, harder to track." They rode east deliberately, leaving clear tracks in the snow. By late afternoon, they reached a narrow, swift-flowing waterway that cut through the landscape like a dark ribbon against the white snow. Its edges were frozen, but the center still flowed freely. As they followed the riverbank, Nara tensed, one hand gripping Logan's arm. "There," she whispered, pointing to the far bank. "Between trees." Logan caught a flicker of movement, just a shadow shifting among shadows, then another further downstream. Their pursuers had anticipated their route. "How many?" Logan asked. "3, maybe 4, Nara replied. "They wear Apache dress but move wrong. Too heavy. Apache move like water over stone. These men move like bear through brush." "Not Apache warriors then, but white men, disguised as such, Crawford's men." "They're trying to flank us," Logan observed. "We need to cross now, before the trap closes." Logan created a diversion, drawing their pursuers' attention while Nara crossed with the horse. The plan worked initially. As the men pursued him downstream, Logan found a crossing point and plunged into the icy water. The shock of cold nearly paralyzed him, but determination drove him forward. A shot rang out. Pain seared across his upper arm as a bullet grazed him. Logan staggered but kept moving, reaching the far bank and dragging himself into the shelter of the trees as more shots followed. Wet to the bone in freezing temperatures, hypothermia became a greater threat than bullets. Each step was an act of defiance against his body's growing desire to surrender to the cold. Night had fallen by the time he staggered into the clearing where they had agreed to meet. His vision had narrowed, his world reduced to placing one foot in front of the other. Then a flicker of light penetrated his fog, a small, carefully shielded fire. A figure rose from beside it. "Logan." Nara's voice seemed distant, though she was suddenly beside him, supporting him as his legs gave way. With surprising strength, she half-carried him toward the fire. "Cold," he managed through numb lips. "I know," she said, her voice tight with controlled fear. "Need remove wet clothes, now." Survival trumped modesty. Nara worked efficiently, replacing his frozen clothing with dry blankets and heated stones placed against his core and feet. "Drink," she commanded, holding a cup of hot herbal tea to his lips. Gradually, sensation returned to his extremities, painful but welcome. As his mind cleared, Logan became aware of Nara's expression, concern mixed with something that looked remarkably like relief. "You came back," she said softly. "Thought maybe they kill you, that I bring death to man who saved me. Again." There was such vulnerability in her voice that Logan found himself reaching for her hand. "I'm harder to kill than that," he said, attempting lightness, though the river made a good attempt. They made plans to reach a place Nara knew, a hidden valley with healing waters sacred to the Apache. It was a risk, but continuing alone through unknown territory, with Crawford actively hunting them, was the greater danger. The sacred valley lay sheltered by towering cliffs, accessible only through a narrow canyon that wound between stark rock walls. By the time they reached it, Logan's arm had developed an angry red streak, infection spreading from his bullet wound. Fever gripped him, his body alternating between chills and burning heat. "Need medicine," Nara declared, examining the wound. "Healing waters help, but not enough alone." As they descended into the valley, steam rose from several pools scattered across the valley floor, their mineral-rich waters creating an oasis of relative warmth in the winter landscape. A thin wisp of smoke caught their eye, rising from behind a cluster of rocks near one of the larger pools. Nara approached cautiously while Logan waited with the horse. When she returned, an old woman accompanied her, ancient by frontier standards, her white hair braided with small talismans of bone and feather. "This Apache," Nara introduced, "medicine woman of my people. She know me from when I small." The old woman examined Logan's arm with critical eyes. "She say infection bad," Nara translated. "Needs strong medicine and prayer." Logan allowed himself to be led to a small shelter near one of the steaming pools. Inside, a pony prepared a medicinal paste, applying it to his wound while muttering prayers in Apache. The paste burned initially, then became oddly numbing. As the old woman worked, Nara learned troubling news. "Hototo been here," she told Logan, 3 days ago, with warriors. "He not just want marriage now, he want revenge. Think I dishonor him by running, by staying with white man." The medicine, combined with exhaustion and fever, soon dragged Logan toward unconsciousness. The last thing he saw was Nara's face etched with concern that went beyond mere alliance of convenience. Dreams came to him in his fever-vivid visions of the past. He was young again, a border patrol officer riding with Crawford's unit. They approached an Apache village, but instead of peace, they brought fire and death. Logan tried to stop it, to protest, but dream logic rendered him helpless. Then amid the chaos, a small form caught his attention, a child hidden beneath brush and dirt. Without thought, he dismounted, lifted the child, and ran. The child's face shifted, becoming clearer, until he was looking at a younger version of Nara. Recognition dawned, pieces clicking into place. "You found me, the child who was," Nara said. "Now I find you." Logan jerked awake, his body drenched in sweat. The fever had broken, leaving him weak but clear-headed. Outside, he found Nara and a pony in conversation by one of the moonlit pools. "She say she know you, Ki," Nara said hesitantly when Logan approached. "From long ago." Logan's dream came rushing back, not a dream at all, but a memory his fever had unlocked. "Ask her how," he said quietly. Nara relayed the question, listened to a pony's response, then turned back to Logan with wide eyes. "She say you the soldier, the one who saved me when village burned. She recognized your eyes." The confirmation hit Logan like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. His mind reeled, fragments of memory crystallizing into horrific clarity. The flames, the screams, the helplessness he'd felt as Crawford's men swept through the village. And then the small figure, half buried in dirt, in brush, eyes wide with terror, and the reflected light of burning homes. His hands began to tremble. 15 years of buried guilt surfaced in a rush that threatened to drown him. He'd been part of that unit. He'd worn the same uniform as the men who slaughtered innocents. His inaction, his failure to stop it sooner, had cost dozens of lives. Yet in the midst of that hell, he'd managed one small act of mercy, saving a child who now stood before him as a woman. A complex storm of emotions overwhelmed him. Shame at his association with Crawford, relief that at least one life had been spared by his actions, and a terrible dawning fear of how Nara would now see him. Would she hate him for being part of the force that destroyed her family? Would she consider his rescue too little, too late? The thought of losing her respect, her trust, pierced him more deeply than he would have believed possible just days ago. "It's true," Logan finally said, his voice barely audible. "I was there. He forced himself to meet her gaze, to accept whatever judgment she might render. I found you beneath your mother's body. You were so still, I thought. His voice broke. But then you opened your eyes and I couldn't just leave you there. Nara stood utterly still, her body rigid as stone. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she simply stared at him, her eyes searching his face as if seeing it for the first time. Then a tremor ran through her, subtle at first, growing until her hands shook visibly. You, she whispered. The word held 15 years of questions, of searching, of wondering. Her next reaction surprised them both. She reached out her fingertips, brushing his cheek with unexpected gentleness. The touch was tentative, as if confirming he was real and not some fever dream. Then her hand dropped suddenly and her expression hardened. You were there, you wore their uniform, you rode with them. Her voice was low-edged with the betrayal of new understanding. All this time, while I tell you about village, about mother dying, about searching for soldier, you say nothing. Logan started to speak, but Nara raised her hand, stopping him. No, let me finish. She took a deep breath, visibly fighting for control. For 15 years, I wonder why one soldier saved child when others kill. I wonder what kind of man do this. I search for him for you to understand. Her fingers moved to the bandana at her neck, clutching it like a talisman. When I find you in snow, when you carry me like you carry me, then but not know. When I see badge in your cabin, I wonder but not certain. Her eyes flashed with a complex mix of anger and confusion. Now I stand before man who both destroyed my world and saved my life. How I feel about this, I not know. You know, she finally asked, her voice calmer but intense. All this time while we traveled together, you know who I am. When they spoke with the pony further, they learned more disturbing news. Crawford had been the one who ordered the village burned. He wasn't just hunting any Apache woman for bounty, he was hunting Nara, specifically the survivor who could testify to his crimes. And now finding her with Logan, another witness, made them both targets. We need to reach your father, Logan decided. Bring him this information. Crawford isn't just a threat to you or to me, he's a threat to all Apache in the territory. But Hototo watched trails, Nara reminded him, and now he tell lies about me. Father may not listen. A pony offered help, a secret path to the reservation unknown to white men, and a message for Nara's father that he would have to respect. That night by the moonlit pool, Logan and Nara finally confronted the truth of their shared past and what it meant for their future. I searched for you, Nara said softly, for years. Want to understand how same man can bring both death and life. I've asked myself the same question, Logan admitted. Why I didn't stop it. Why I only saved one child when I could have done more. They sat in silence by the moonlit pool, the steam from the healing waters rising between them like a veil. Neither spoke for a long while, each lost in their own thoughts, processing the weight of their shared past. The distance between them, a mere few feet of rocky ground, felt both vast and insignificant against the 15 years that had separated their fates. Finally, Nara reached into the water, her fingers creating ripples that spread outward in ever-widening circles. The elders say water has memory, she said softly, that it carries all it has touched, all it has witnessed. She looked up at Logan, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. Like us, we carry all we have seen, all we have done, all that was done to us. Some things are too heavy to carry alone. Logan replied, his voice rough. Nara studied him, her expression thoughtful. The man who rode with Crawford's unit and the man who carried me from flames, they same man. The man who built cabin to hide from world and man who saved me from wolves also same. She extended her hand, palm up between them. Not all white, not all dark, like dawn sky both at once. Logan looked at her outstretched hand, then slowly placed his own palm against hers. Their fingers interlaced, a bridge across the chasm of their different worlds. I spent 15 years trying to forget, he admitted. You spent 15 years trying to remember. Maybe that's why we found each other again. Maybe, Nara agreed. Or maybe spirits have sense of humor. A small smile touched her lips, the first since the revelation. In that moment, something shifted between them. Not forgiveness exactly, for some wounds were too deep for simple healing, but understanding. A recognition that their lives were bound together by forces beyond their control, yet the path forward would be of their own choosing. Crawford must answer for what he do, Nara finally declared. Not just for my village, but for all Apache he kill. Yes, Logan agreed firmly. I'll help you bring him to justice. Whatever it takes. Following the hidden path a pony had revealed took them 3 grueling days traversing high mountain ridges and narrow canyons where even the horse struggled to pass. They traveled mostly in silence, both still processing the revelation that had fundamentally altered their relationship. On the evening of the 3rd day, they crested a ridge and saw the Apache reservation spread below them, a collection of dwellings nestled in a broad valley, smoke rising from cooking fires into the twilight sky. They approached under cover of darkness, seeking out Nara's aunt before confronting her father. The older woman listened gravely to their story, then led them through the settlement to the chief's dwelling. Chief Maka sat on a raised platform covered with furs, his face aged by the burden of leadership, but his eyes sharp and piercing. When his gaze fell on Nara, relief flickered across his features, quickly suppressed. When it shifted to Logan, all warmth vanished. Father, Nara said, stepping forward, I have returned, but not to submit. Then why return at all? Maka asked in perfect English. To bring further shame to your people. To bring truth, Nara replied steadily. To warn you of danger that threatens all Apache, not just me. What danger could be greater than the disunity you create by rejecting the husband chosen for you? The danger of James Crawford. Nara said the name falling like a stone into still water. The effect on Maka was immediate. His body tensed, the facade of indifference cracking to reveal something darker beneath. What do you know of Crawford? He demanded. Logan stepped forward. I served with him in the border patrol 15 years ago. I was there the day he ordered the raid on your wife's village. Maka's head snapped up. You were there? Yes, Logan admitted. I couldn't stop it, but He saved me, Nara finished. When everyone else was killed, he found me hidden and carried me away. She touched the scrap of bandana at her neck. This was his. A heavy silence fell. Maka's gaze moved between them, assessing, calculating. I found her, he said to Logan, by the stream wrapped in your uniform cloth. I raised her as my own when her mother, my sister, was killed in that raid. Before Logan could respond, the dwelling's entrance flap was thrust aside and a warrior entered, younger than Logan, his face marked by a scar from temple to jaw, his eyes burning with fury as they fixed on Nara. Hototo, Nara said, her voice flat. The warrior ignored her, addressing Maka directly. You allow this? The woman who refused me returns with her white man, and you welcome them. Maka remained impassive. I welcome no one yet. I listen. A chief must hear all sides before judgment. What is there to judge? Hototo's hand moved to his knife. This white man has stolen what was promised to me. Nara stepped between them, facing Hototo with cold fury. I was never yours to steal. I am not property to be promised or traded. I am Nara, daughter of Maka, and I make my own choice. Hototo's laugh was ugly. Your choice? What choice do any of us have now confined to this reservation like animals? What weakens us is blindness to the real threat, Nara countered. Crawford hunts Apache for bounty. He killed my mother's village 15 years ago, and now he hunts me, the witness who can prove his crimes. Before the argument could escalate further, a young warrior burst in. Chief riders approached from the north, many men heavily armed. Not soldiers, they dress as Apache, but move like white men. Maka rose to his feet. Crawford, he said, looking at Logan for confirmation. Logan nodded. He's tracked us here. Came for both of us. The chief's decision was immediate. Sound the alarm. Get the women and children to safety. Warriors to defensive positions. He turned to Hototo. This is no time for personal quarrels. If what they say is true, all Apache are threatened. Hototo hesitated, then gave a curt nod. I go to my warriors, but this is not finished between us, he added, fixing Logan with a deadly stare. When he had gone, Maka turned to Logan. You know this man Crawford? How will he attack? Directly, Logan replied. He's confident, arrogant. He believes in overwhelming force, not stealth. Outside the settlement transformed into an armed camp. Warriors took up defensive positions behind dwellings and barricades. Logan positioned himself at the northern perimeter with Nara beside him, rifle in hand. As darkness fell, a tense silence descended over the settlement. Warriors crouched behind barricades, families huddled in the safety of the caves, and Maka stood at the center of the camp, a commanding presence despite the danger. Beside him, Logan checked his rifle one last time, his mind running through tactics Crawford might employ. They come, Nara whispered, her body tensing beside him as she pointed to the northern ridge. In the silvery moonlight, horsemen emerged from the trees like ghosts materializing from smoke. They spread in a wide arc along the ridge, their silhouettes stark against the night sky. At the center, unmistakable even at this distance, sat Crawford. His posture was erect, confident, the bearing of a man who expected victory rather than feared defeat. 15 men, Logan counted quietly, maybe 20, armed with repeating rifles from the looks of it. Maka nodded grimly. They outnumber our warriors, but we have the advantage of ground. The settlement lay in a shallow depression, surrounded by scattered boulders and earthworks the Apache had constructed over years of living on the reservation. Not a fortress by any means, but defensible if used wisely. Crawford's voice carried across the open ground, unnaturally loud in the night air. Maka, I've come for the woman and the traitor. Send them out and your people won't suffer. The chief didn't respond. Instead, he raised his hand in a signal that every warrior understood. Wait. Crawford's patience lasted less than a minute. Very well, you've made your choice. The first volley came as a thunderclap, muzzle flashes, illuminating the night like lightning. Bullets kicked up dust and splintered wood around the Apache positions, but found few targets thanks to the warriors' discipline. Hold, Mika commanded, as some of the younger warriors shifted restlessly. Wait until they come closer. Crawford's men, emboldened by the lack of response, began to advance down the slope, horses picking their way carefully in the darkness. When they reached the halfway point, Maka's voice rang out. Now! The night erupted with the concentrated fire of 30 Apache rifles, all targeted on the advancing line. The effect was devastating. Horses screamed and reared, men fell, and confusion spread through Crawford's ranks. At least 5 attackers lay motionless on the ground, while others scrambled for cover behind rocks or their fallen mounts. But Crawford rallied them quickly, shouting orders that brought structure to the chaos. His men spread out, taking cover where they could find it, establishing a ragged firing line that began to pour lead into the settlement's defenses. They're trying to pin us down while others circle around, Logan observed, spotting movement along the settlement's eastern edge. Maka nodded. Hototo, take 5 warriors to the east barrier. Stop any who try to flank us. The scarred warrior, any personal grievances temporarily set aside in the face of a common enemy, moved to obey without question, gathering men as he went. For the next hour, the battle settled into a brutal rhythm of advance and retreat. Crawford's men would push forward only to be driven back by concentrated Apache fire. The Apache would attempt counterattacks only to be forced to cover by the superior firepower of the attackers' repeating rifles. We can't keep this up indefinitely, Logan told Maka during a momentary lull. They have more ammunition than we do. And we have nowhere to retreat to, the chief replied grimly. This is our home. We stand or fall here. As the moon reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the battlefield, Logan spotted a movement that sent a chill through his blood. Crawford, along with 3 of his men, had worked their way to a position that gave them a clear line of sight to Maka's command position. Chief's in danger, Logan said to Nara. Crawford's flanking the central defense. Without hesitation, Nara grabbed extra ammunition. We go. They moved through the settlement like shadows, using the chaos of battle as cover. Twice they had to freeze as Crawford's men passed nearby, and once they barely avoided being shot by jumpy Apache defenders. But they reached the eastern perimeter just as Crawford and his men were setting up their ambush. Logan could see Crawford clearly now, his face illuminated by muzzle flashes as he took aim at Maka. There was a gleeful malice in his expression, the look of a man about to settle a long-held grudge. Take the shot, Nara urged, her voice steady despite the bullets whining overhead. Logan sighted down his rifle, leading the target slightly to account for Crawford's movement. He squeezed the trigger at the exact moment Crawford fired. Logan's bullet struck true, hitting Crawford's rifle and knocking it from his hands with a metallic clang. Crawford's shot went wild, missing Maka by inches. Crawford whirled, his face contorting with rage as he spotted Logan and Nara. Harrington, he snarled, drawing a revolver from his belt. Should have known you'd side with savages. Always were soft on them. It's over, Crawford, Logan called back, keeping his rifle trained on his former commanding officer. Look around you. Your men are deserting. There's nowhere left to run. It was true, as the tide of battle had turned, more of Crawford's hired guns had slipped away into the darkness, unwilling to die for a cause that wasn't their own. Now only the most loyal, or the most bloodthirsty, remained. Crawford laughed, a sound devoid of humor or sanity. "You think I care about that? You think I came all this way for money?" His eyes burned with a fanatic light. "This was never about bounties, Harrington. This was about finishing what we started 15 years ago. About cleansing this territory of the Apache plague once and for all." He gestured toward Nara with his revolver. "Starting with her, the one that got away. The witness who could bring it all down on our heads if she ever talked to the right people." His gaze shifted to Logan. "And you, the weak link who couldn't stomach what needed to be done. The one who reported us to command." The admission hung in the air, damning in its clarity. Not just murder for profit, but a systematic attempt to eliminate witnesses to past atrocities. "The Army never believed me," Logan said, pieces of the past falling into place. "That's why nothing was ever done about the raids." "The Army believes what it wants to believe," Crawford sneered. "And what was easier to believe, that a decorated officer conducted illegal raids, or that a soft-hearted recruit couldn't handle the realities of the frontier?" While Crawford talked, Nara had been slowly shifting position, moving to flank him, while his attention was focused on Logan. Now she signaled with the barest nod of her head, ready. Crawford's men had spread out, taking cover behind rocks and keeping their rifles trained on Logan. But their attention was divided between the immediate confrontation and the larger battle still raging around the settlement. "You won't make it out of here alive," Logan said, keeping Crawford's focus on him. "Too many warriors between you and freedom." Maybe, Crawford acknowledged, his finger tightening on the trigger. "But I'll take you both with me. A fair trade." He fired 3 shots in rapid succession, forcing Logan to dive behind a boulder. The bullets struck stone, sending chips flying like shrapnel. Logan rolled to his right, came up on one knee, and returned fire, forcing Crawford to duck. In that moment of distraction, Nara made her move. She'd circled behind Crawford, using the cover of darkness in the surrounding rocks. Now she fired with deadly precision. Her bullet caught Crawford in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his revolver flying from his hand. Logan was on him in seconds, tackling him to the ground before he could recover. Crawford fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, landing a solid blow to Logan's jaw that sent stars across his vision. But Logan had youth and righteous purpose on his side. He pinned Crawford, disarming him completely. Crawford's remaining men, seeing their leader captured, threw down their weapons. The fight had gone out of them. Maka arrived with several warriors, his face streaked with the dust and smoke of battle, but his bearing still regal. He looked down at Crawford, who lay gasping and bleeding on the ground. "James Crawford," Maka said, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of grief and anger. "You will answer for your crimes against my people." Crawford spat blood onto the ground. "Your people," he sneered, defiant even in defeat. "You're nothing but animals penned in a reservation. I did this territory a service, cleaning out the vermin." A murmur of anger ran through the gathered warriors. Several raised their weapons, and for a moment Logan thought they would execute Crawford on the spot, a fate few would argue he didn't deserve. But Maka raised his hand and silence fell immediately. "No," he said firmly, "we are not like him. We do not murder helpless enemies, even those who have shown us no mercy." He turned to his warriors. "Bind his wounds, then take him to the territorial authorities in Santa Fe. Let him stand trial before both our justice and theirs. Let all know what he has done, and let his punishment be a warning to others who would harm the Apache." Crawford laughed bitterly. "Trial, there won't be a white jury in the territory that will convict a man for killing Apache, even if they believe your stories, which they won't." "Perhaps not," Logan said, standing over the man who had once been his commanding officer. "But they'll convict you for the white settlers you murdered and blamed on the Apache. For the women and children you killed to start wars that benefited no one but yourself. For the crimes against humanity that have nothing to do with race and everything to do with your own depravity." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Crawford's eyes as the warriors bound his hands and lifted him to his feet. As they led him away toward the holding pen used for livestock, his bravado crumbled, revealing the coward beneath the cruel exterior. Around them, the battle was ending. The remaining attackers, seeing their leader captured, either surrendered or fled into the night. The Apache rounded up prisoners, tended to wounded on both sides, and began the grim task of counting their dead. By midnight, the settlement was secure once more. 3 warriors had died defending their homes, and 7 more were wounded. But they had prevailed against overwhelming odds against an enemy that had come with the sole purpose of destruction. As the adrenaline of battle faded, Logan realized he was bleeding from a cut above his eye he didn't remember receiving. His muscles ached from the fight with Crawford, and the night's events had left him bone-weary. But there was a clarity to his exhaustion, a purpose that had been missing for too long. Nara appeared at his side, a cloth in her hand. Without speaking, she began to clean the blood from his face, her touch gentle despite the calluses on her fingers. Her own face bore a scratch along one cheek, but otherwise she seemed unharmed. "You fought well," he said simply. She paused, meeting his eyes. "We fought together," she corrected. "As it should be." In the aftermath, Logan found Nara standing alone at the edge of the settlement, looking out at the moon-silvered landscape. "We won the battle," she said when he approached. "But what comes next? What of us?" It was the question that had hovered between them since the revelation at the Healing Waters. What did their shared past mean for their future? "That depends," Logan said carefully, "on what you want, on what I want, on what's possible." "And what do you want, Logan Harrington?" Nara asked. He took a deep breath. "I want to stop running from the past. I want to find purpose beyond survival." He paused, then added, "And I want to know if there's a place for me in your world or a place for you in mine." A small smile touched Nara's lips. "Maybe we make new world. Not yours, not mine. Ours." Maka approached, his expression somber but no longer hostile as he looked at Logan. "You fought for my people tonight," the chief said. "You helped bring justice for my sister and her village. For that, you have my gratitude." "I only tried to right a wrong that I should have prevented 15 years ago," Logan replied. Maka nodded. "Some wrongs cannot be fully righted, but the attempt matters." He turned to his daughter. "And you, Nara, you have shown courage and wisdom beyond your years." Nara straightened. "Then you understand why I cannot marry Hototo, why I must choose my own path." For a long moment, Maka was silent, tradition battling with his love for his daughter. "I understand," he said finally. "The old ways are changing. Perhaps they must change if our people are to survive." He glanced at Logan, then back to Nara. "But what path will you choose now?" Nara took Logan's hand in a gesture that needed no translation. "We have not decided, but we will decide together." Maka's expression softened into acceptance. "Then may your path bring you both peace, and may it sometimes lead back here to your people." After the chief departed, they stood together beneath the vast, star-filled sky. "What now?" Nara asked, her hand still in Logan's. "We could stay here for a time," he suggested. "Help rebuild. Then when spring comes—" He trailed off, possibilities stretching before them. "When spring comes," Nara prompted, a smile playing at her mouth, "we could build something new, maybe a place between worlds where others like us could find refuge." "Between worlds," Nara repeated. "Not Apache, not white, just people." Logan felt purpose taking root where only emptiness had been before. "It won't be easy," he cautioned. "There will be those on both sides who won't understand." "When path easy?" Nara asked. "When journey worth taking?" The simple wisdom made him smile. "Never," he acknowledged. They stood together as the night deepened, their shared past no longer a burden but a foundation for whatever future they might build. From separate paths carved by grief and injustice, they had found each other twice, once in fire, once in ice. Now standing on the threshold of a future neither could fully envision, but both embraced, they turned toward the settlement, ready for whatever came next, not just surviving, living.